Okay. Hi, everybody. My name is Jessica, and I'm presenting with Vanetta and Kellyanne, and we're doing our presentation on denouncing the continued overrepresentation of First Nations children in Canadian child welfare.
Okay, we would like to begin with the land acknowledgement. We would like to begin by acknowledging the land that on which we gather and which the region of Peel operates is part of the treaty land of the territories of the Mississaugas of the Credit. For thousands of years, Indigenous people inhabited and cared for this land and continue to do so today. In particular, we acknowledge the territory of the Anishinaabe, Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Ojibwe Chippewa people, the land that is home to the Métis and most recently the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, who are direct descendants of the Mississaugas of the First Credit. We are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land and by doing so, give our respects to the first inhabitants.
This is our agenda for what we will be discussing today. We will begin with the history and we will take you through to what is currently happening today. And we will end with truth and reconciliation.
Okay, so to begin, we are going to talk a bit about the history of the colonization of First Nations people. There's a really long history of colonialism and discrimination when it comes to the treatment of First Nations people, particularly their children. Atrocities like residential schools and the 60s scoop make up a part of the discrimination and colonialism faced by First Nations people. The history of colonialism is seen as a direct cause of why there are many Indigenous children currently in child welfare as compared to non-Indigenous children. And as well, there's also the Indian Act. The Canadian government created the Indian Act in 1876, which has attacked the traditional values of First Nations people. The Indian Act was created to define who was and who was not an Indian. The Act also outlines in what ways someone could gain or lose their legal Indian status. The goal of the Indian Act was for Indigenous people to give up their legal and cultural identity. The Canadian government wanted Indigenous people to assimilate. For example, an Indigenous woman would lose her legal status if she were to marry a non-Indigenous man. Next, we'll touch a bit on residential schools. The first residential school opened in Saskatchewan in 1883. An amendment in the Indian Act made it so that residential schools were mandatory for children's ages 7 to 15 and gave the state authority to force First Nations children to attend. The goal of residential schools was to assimilate First Nations children by separating them from their parents, their language, and their culture. Then replace Indigenous spiritual beliefs with the Christian religion. Although overseen by the federal government, they were run in large by the Catholic Church and other sects such as Anglican and Protestant. As an educational institution, residential schools were complete failures as there was lack of funding and many teachers were underqualified, classrooms were overcrowded, and schoolwork was based on rote memorization. Many First Nations children were abused as an attempt to civilize them, and many children were physically abused for very minor infractions or if they tried to speak in their own language. Physical and sexual abuse was prominent in residential schools due to the government's failure to act on the allegations of sexual abuse. It was stated that around half the children who attended residential schools died due to the intense abuse. The last residential school was closed its doors in 1996, only a short 28 years ago. And I also want to share a quote that's on the screen. I'll just read that out. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, his habits and training, our mode of thought are an Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from the parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. And that was said by Sir John A. Macdonald, who was the Prime Minister of Canada at the time. Next, we will talk about the 60s scoop. In the mid-50s, laws regarding child welfare changed to allow provincial legislation to apply to First Nation reserves. Lack of knowledge regarding to Indigenous culture and lack of sensitivity of socioeconomic factors led to children being taken off reserve and placed in care of non-Indigenous homes. Many child welfare workers felt they were doing the right thing taking children from their parents, as they were saving these children from a life of poverty that was common on the reserves. Poverty that was brought on by lack of supports by the Canadian government. This widespread removal of children from the reserve from the 1960s to the 1980s was widely referred to as the 60s scoop. Often children were placed in foster homes of non-Indigenous families that did not provide proper care, and many children suffer physical and sexual abuse. As well, many children were placed in non-Indigenous homes, resulting in the loss of their culture, many children not even knowing their ancestry until they were adults. By the end of the 60s, 30 to 40% of legal wards in Canada were First Nations children. This overrepresentation of Indigenous children and welfare did not end after this, rather continues until today. Next are the impacts. There are many significant impacts for First Nations people due to the colonial efforts of the Canadian government and specifically residential schools. Impacts such as intergenerational trauma, which is the concept that generations after a significant event still suffer from the trauma even if they did not experience it themselves. As well, many suffer from substance abuse, depression, or even suicide. There's also increase of domestic violences in the home. Many who suffer from intense trauma, such as residential schools, may still suffer from post-traumatic stress disorder. Due to residential schools wanting to make First Nations children assimilate to the dominant culture, there is also significant loss of language and culture for many, especially for children from the 60s scoop era who did not know that they were even First Nations. There is also a concept of impaired parenting, which is the idea that has been put forward that due to a large percentage of children being forced to attend residential schools, they were taken from their parents and given to caretakers who were often cold and abusive, leading to an entire generation of children who potentially grow up to be adults not knowing how to parent the next generation due to the abuse that they faced.
Okay, so now we will look at the number of children in care. And when you look at the number of kids in foster care from the Indigenous community, the figures are pretty high. The percentage of Indigenous children in care jumped from 47.8% in 2011 to 51.7% in 2016, with the Inuit community seeing the biggest spike. By 2021, 50.65% of First Nations kids and 63.4% of Métis kids were placed with non-Indigenous families. According to Statistics Canada, in 2021, Indigenous kids made up 7.7% of children under 15 in the general population, but 53% of them were in foster care. Manitoba has the highest number of kids in care. In 2016, for every 1,000 child in care, 63% were Indigenous, and even though it dropped a bit to 61.8% by 2021, it's still a serious concern. And we're going to look at Jordan's principle. Jordan's principle came about because he was a child who died in the hospital while waiting for the government to decide who should pay for his medical care once he was released from hospital. He died in the hospital, never spending a day at home with his foster family. Members of Parliament voted to pass Jordan's principle in December 2007 so that First Nations children can receive the same medical care and financial support as any other child in Canada. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal fined a non-compliance against Canada that discriminated against Jordan's principle and ordered Canada to uphold Jordan's legacy. Canada failed to comply, and in April 2016, they were served with 20 more non-compliance, leading to 1.4 million services that and products to support First Nations children through Jordan's principle. Now we're going to look at the neglect and abuse. The number of children that experience abuse in foster care among Indigenous children is quite high. By the age of 15, 40% have experienced abuse compared to 29% of non-Indigenous children. 74% of children in care have experienced physical abuse by an adult compared to 70% of non-Indigenous children. And when looking at sexual abuse, those numbers are also high, with 44% of Indigenous children experiencing sexual abuse compared to 37% of non-Indigenous children. And looking at the statistics in the chart, it clearly shows the rate of abuse with Indigenous children is higher in each category compared to non-Indigenous children. And when we speak about Jordan's principle and the investment that was made to help dismantle the abuse, then you look at this chart from 2019, you can see how high these numbers are, and you question whether enough is being done.
So continuing, this is a glance into the First Nations Canadian Incident Study of Reported Child Abuse and Neglect 2019, known as FNCIS 2019. This is the fourth national study of reported and investigated child maltreatment in Canada. The intentions of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, known as TRC, was to address the documentations of inequities and harm. Unfortunately, the findings demonstrated how inadequate reducing disparities for the First Nation children have been. Although the photos are small, look at each bar graph and take a closer look at the light blue columns. This represents the First Nations children. With a simple glance, you can see how these columns are much larger than the dark blue columns representing the non-Indigenous children. This is a small snapshot of the study. We focused on house conditions, primary caregiver risks, child functioning concerns, and child identity. Looking at the results from house conditions, full-time employment, 58% non-Indigenous versus 27% First Nations. Owning a home, 38% non-Indigenous versus 10% First Nations. Ran out of money for necessities, 10% non-Indigenous versus 24% First Nations. First Nations children face multiple challenges such as unsafe housing conditions, poverty, and overcrowded housing. Reviewing primary caregiver risk factors. Alcohol abuse, 9% non-Indigenous versus 34% First Nations. Cognitive impairment, 3% non-Indigenous versus 10% First Nations. Mental health issues, 25% non-Indigenous versus 34% First Nations. Caregivers with First Nation children are more likely to face complex needs, have few social supports, and experience mental health concerns. Looking at child functioning concerns, positive taxology at birth, 1% non-Indigenous versus 5% First Nations. Failure to meet developing milestones, 5% non-Indigenous versus 11% First Nations. Attachment issues, 6% non-Indigenous versus 11% First Nations. Lastly, looking at the identity of the children. 299,217 child maltreatment investigations occurred. 45,918 involved First Nation children. In 2019, for every 1,000 First Nation children, there was an estimated 151 child welfare investigations. They also noted that First Nation children aged 0 to 15 were 3.6 times likely to be subjected to child maltreatment related investigations. Okay, so now looking at the current structure of Indigenous child welfare. The legislation applies to all Indigenous people. However, it varies in jurisdictions. The federal government is responsible for the funding. However, in the 1980s, First Nations communities provided child welfare services and developed 120 Indigenous child and family services. The most common type of governing models in place for First Nations child and family services are the delegated model, fully or partially responsible by First Nations welfare agencies. The second is the integrated model. Both Indigenous communities and the province share authority and the individual bilateral agreements with Indigenous agencies. In 2020, Bill C-92 came into effect, in which supports Indigenous communities a right over provincial child welfare legislations. The Act also ensures culture continues, prioritizing children placement with families and notifying communities involved with Indigenous children. Unfortunately, the Act has received many criticisms due to the limited discussions prior to implementation, the lack of funding causing disputes between jurisdictions, and shows a controversy by repeating historical discriminations against communities developing services for deserving family is based on funding. Looking at Smallwood et al. Sorry, we'll just go back. Looking at the article on Smallwood et al. Produced a scoping review, which is research on various literature to explore the address question. The review's direction was understanding the impacts of historical trauma due to colonization and on the health and well-being of Indigenous young people. There were 4 major themes noticed: mental and physical health, emotional response, risky behavior, and relationship breakdown. Listed under each major theme are instances that occurred, such as anxiety, suicide risk, violent offending, gambling, substance abuse, emotional neglect, and isolation. Under each theme, there was also suggestions to guide the well-being of Indigenous young people. To support mental health and physical, a recommendation was culture reclamation, and this was to lead positive sense of self and sense of cultural identity. To support emotional response was to utilize harm reduction approaches that encourage to see past negativity and shape their future toward healing. To support risky behaviors, it included positive connections to family and communities, and to participate in cultural community events, focusing on strong social connections and adopting a role model such as an elder to navigate them. So now we're looking at the inequities, risks, harms, and impacts of children. And this has affected First Nations children and families and communities accessing basic rights, human rights, and it goes beyond child welfare. Looking at statistics, 51% First Nations children live in poverty. 48% First Nation households are food insecure. 28% First Nations do not have water pipe access. 1.5% have no water service at all. 1 in 4 First Nation households are overcrowded compared to 1 in 20 of the general population. Lack of resources, and the most unfortunate is Aboriginal poverty is viewed as neglect instead of the truth, which is a failed government policy. Structural inequities, racism, trauma, forced removal of children play a critical role in the disparities in child welfare. Looking at the risks of harm versus the risks of future maltreatment, when a child has been placed at a risk of harm, they have experienced an event that has endangered their physical or emotional health. Risk of future maltreatment refers to situations where the incident of maltreatment has not occurred, but circumstances such as parental substance abuse indicated there is a risk of maltreatment occurring in future. The FNCIS 2019 includes both types of situations within their definition of maltreatment, leading us to the impacts that call for change. Generations of passing trauma severed culture and traditions, breakdown of parenting models, and long-lasting psychological abuse. The major concern is that in 2020, only 8 of the 94 calls of action have been implemented. This is quite concerning and demonstrates pushing the importance of monitoring numbers and the real reason for child welfare.
Making it right. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada released its finding on the history and the impact of Indian residential school system in Canada. Over 6,000 survivors of the IRS had their voices heard, their stories told, their experiences, treatment, and the trauma that they endured. In 2015, the call to action for the Government of Canada to reduce the number of Aboriginal children in the welfare system. It was found by the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal that the Canadian government was discriminating against 165,000 First Nations children by providing flawed child and welfare services. On June 21st, 2020, the Act respecting First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children, youth, and family came into effect. In 2021, Indigenous children accounted for 7.7 of the children in foster care, but 58% that is in Canada. In 2022, Canada implemented measures to reduce the number of First Nations children in care and provided support to families, youth, and children. And between 2023 and 2024, the government invested $3.5 billion into helping families, children, and youth. So now we're going to talk about funding for Indigenous children. Jordan's principal and Trout class settlement was finalized in October 2023 and was rewarded $23.3 billion. This money is to support First Nations children affected by Jordan's principle so First Nations children can receive essential care right away. It also supports children so that they receive services and break down barriers they are facing. $20 billion in funding will go to enhancing services in the Indigenous communities and to ensure that children are not removed from their homes. And $5 million will go to different projects that will promote safety and addressing maltreatment towards Indigenous children and youth.
Head Start 2013 source. However, with 2020 still not being implemented, all 94 calls to action, this is truly illustrated how Canada needs true steps for reconciliation. Step 1, acknowledgement. People have been traumatized and the harmful and devastating past needs to be recognized for the reasons for the trauma. Step 2, truth. The entire truth must be spoken to inspire true reconciliation, and this has yet to be done. Step 3, admit to recent abuse. Children are still hungry today and only because their communities are depleted. Step 4, mindset. The past cannot be rewritten. However, having a proper mindset to understand the reality of the countless horrific experiences. Step 5, recognition. Residential schools need to truly be acknowledged in how this was utterly wrong and how it was a major negative impact. Taking a closer look at the 5 calls to action pertaining child welfare. 1, reduce Aboriginal children in care. 2, annual reports of Aboriginal children in care versus non-Aboriginal children. 3, Jordan's principle. 4, establish national standards for Aboriginal children. 5, develop culturally appropriate programs. In conclusion, we have seen only 8 out of the 94 calls to action have been implemented. How will addressing children in welfare be accomplished with only 5 steps if 94 actions have no priority in being implemented and established? Leading us to the end of our presentation, thank you for listening, and we hope you have gained knowledge in denouncing the continued overrepresentation of the First Nations children in Canadian welfare. Thank you.
Thank you.
No.